in this idea of society that we imagine to be different than the one that we're living in, we probably have to put at the crosshairs of our analysis is the media, right? So much of the media is definitely, it's not to inform, but either to entertain or to terrorize, right? And when we're scared, what I found for, and I'm a sociologist by trade, my PhD's in sociology, when we're scared and when we're feared and when we have these kinds of moments of spectacular violence, that's not when we do our best thinking or our best imagining, right? That's when we lean back on our kind of most conservative, traditional hearted notions.
I'm Colin Burrows, and this is the Woodstein Media Podcast, Episode 9. This podcast is produced on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, and Odawa peoples. The interview was conducted on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This episode features a conversation with Sam Tecle, who works with Success Beyond Limits, a collaborative youth-led community-based movement providing youth with holistic support to complete their education and experience success in their lives. And he also works with Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty, a resident-led grassroots coalition of community residents, activists, workers, and organizations working to eliminate poverty. He is also an associate professor in the Sociology Department at Toronto Metropolitan University, and his research and scholarly work spans the areas of Black and diaspora studies, urban studies, and sociology of education. During the podcast, you will hear a few songs from Toronto Black City Mixtape, a love letter and song to the Black community, released by Black Lives Matter Toronto in 2016. It's available from blacklivesmattertoronto.bandcamp.com. This podcast and Woodstein Media are independently produced journalism that you can support through Patreon or by donating through PayPal at woodstein.ca. That's WOOD-STEIN.ca. Thanks for your interest and support. If you enjoy this podcast, you can support it by listening to more episodes and liking, sharing, subscribing, or reviewing them. We'll just jump right in.
Sure.
And first, I want to get like a perspective of who you are and what the Jane Finch Action Against Poverty is.
Yeah, so we're like a collection of residents, community workers, even elderly folks, aunties, young people, like youth, who have come together since I guess we were founded on in October in 2008, and it's an anti-poverty like organization, and it advocates for workers mainly in the area, really kind of centralized to Jane and Finch, but we've also joined citywide actions and province-wide actions. And it's an anti-poverty organization that's community-based, so it helps workers. We have a lot of temporary agencies, work agencies in the community, so a lot of their work conditions aren't great. A lot of the kind of seasonal workers that come in during the summer and spring that work on the farms are also have connections or families that live in the community. We support various kind of strike actions or labor actions that happen in the area. Most recently, there was a really devastating fire in one of our high-rise low-income housing towers, and we supported with relief and moving folks and displacement, getting folks over to like the temporary hotel or at York when Red Cross came in. So it's just a community organization that attempts to, or a grassroots collective kind of organization that attempts to respond to kind of whatever's going on in the community, going on in the area, and that's pretty much who we are. One last like campaign I would want to mention too is there was some racist and classist policies that some of the grocery stores had implemented that said that young women who had baby carriages or folks with mobile assistant devices couldn't come into the grocery store with them, right? And they were really targeted towards young mothers and our elderly folks. And it was really a policy to try to curb like low income customers from coming into that specific grocery store, right? So if you see, even in our grocery stores, like things like baby formula are locked up behind like double paned glass, locked cages and see-through, which is not the case if you go into other areas that are high income, right? So those are the kinds of things that we respond to. And I mean, now affordability, increasing cost of groceries, we're like doing kind of like an ad hoc study of taking photos of the cost of just basic produce and groceries in our area, and they're like skyrocketing. So a lot of folks, this is a thing that's affecting their quality of life, their ability to feed themselves and their families. So these are the kinds of things that we've been working on and are working on now.
In that, with the skyrocketing prices, we're told to be healthy and eat well and all that.
Yeah.
You can't afford
to.
No,
you can't, especially in areas like Jane and Finch. So we have this new kind of way of thinking about health called like the social determinants of health, where we're moving away from the idea that if you're in poor health, it's simply amalgamation of your choices. You didn't eat right, cholesterol, you had bad. But what if you live in an area where it's very far to get to grocery stores that have good produce? You live in an area where there's not a lot of farmers markets on the street, right? There's some areas in Toronto where you could literally walk out of your house, detached house, and walk to somewhere and get groceries like you're at a farm and come back to your house. That's not an option in Jane and Finch. There's a lot more fast food places. There's a lot more cheap, very poor quality food. A lot of our grocery stores don't have as much produce because the produce that you do end up getting in your grocery stores are based on, a set of choices made by independent grocers, right? And, if they don't think that we eat healthy or that we have a wide palette of groceries, our grocery store shelves never get stocked with those, right? And we live in an area where there's a lot more like cash money, payday lending spots, right? Predatory lenders. So all of those things affect the kind of health choices you're able to make, right? So it's not by accident that you get a lot of kind of higher instances of diabetes in areas that's correlated with poverty. So those are the kinds of things that, they're long fight battles, but they're also part of fighting poverty, right? Again, in our area too, if you I always tell my students, if you wake up at right before dusk or dawn, right before 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, all throughout the year, whether it's Arctic blast freezing like it was last week in the province, or in the summer or spring, you'll see a bunch of folks just lined up at corners with coolers. And they're just trying to get picked up by workers, by employers who employ day laborers, right? And that's going to be a hard job. It's going to be low pay, and you don't have insurance. So if you hurt yourself, that's that. You know what I mean? So those are the kinds of conditions that make up many of the folks that live in our area. That's how their lives look, right? And then also on the first of the month, all these kind of predatory cash money lender spots I mentioned, you'll see a long line out of them because folks are juggling between bills. They need to get their paychecks cashed really quickly to pay this bill that's late so that their lights stay on, but then the other bill so that the heat stays on. And these are the kinds of things that folks make, right? So if you live in a set of conditions like that, then the kinds of choices you're able to make for what you put in your body just to feed and nourish yourself are not going to be the best options available based on what's around, but also because of how close to poverty you're living.
Know my rights, so you gon' need a warrant for that. They already own the land, next they're gonna own the air. My bad, they already own the air. No fly zones, plus they're hiking up the fare. Or should I say they're hiking up the fear? Radio control, yes, it really isn't fair. The mission is control, how do civilians fare?
Fearless of unnatural disasters after the original agreement was broken. For the sake of economic development, we focus on what's relevant in the present. In the strength of unification, we rise nation to nation. Every laying down of the tree is less air we breathe.
Now they make you afraid of salt, so I'm scared to shed a tear. Tell them here, but on this. Gagging with my pen, your ignorance is never bliss. If it ain't now, when to the end I raise my fist. And I swear to defend, even if I had a lisp. Darkness, conquer it with some open-heartedness. Not hard-heartedness.
Like matches trees stack well, fire water near the Keystone frack well. It's sad, he tries to remove us from what he lacks. The answer to the question he dares not ask. The greedy man can't stand his own economic collapse. While the rest of the world awakes, feeling the quakes, the earth she shakes.
Treaties need a unity, affinity. 108 degrees in a pentagram symmetry. Facebook creeping me, sending me the spam saying, Jay, come and sleep with me. Looking for a job, you can feel these ladies' vacancies. The pressure of these women will never be my security. Making me like Geico, but the gecko ain't insuring me.
Some are still sleeping, creeping to their ways, and change arranging ways to dishonor treaties, ignoring prophecies. Still we believe maybe they'll see the need to be and harmony. But to them that's a sales tax, and all this oil and nickel and diamond mining keeps reminding me why we rise flooded with words.
What is the system? I can't trust it. They want me to believe they have my children's heart and interest. What is immoral? What is an ethic? What does it really matter when you're bound to disrespect it? These times are hectic, the kids neglected. The only way to survive the game is stay well connected. So in these moments, in time selected, I hope you start a kissing, cause love is all that we've been missing. The clock is ticking.
Infinite memories beyond lifetimes, alive centuries through bloodlines. From melting icebergs, slowly the world turns faster. Time burns, igniting the eighth fire. My heart yearns, evolving higher and higher.
Brothers, respect mine. Check it out. Leader on the track, no doubt. Can somebody tell me what the cost is of speaking now? Check it out. JJ on the track, no doubt. Can somebody tell me what the point is of going out? Check it out. Gypsy on the track, no doubt. Can somebody tell me what's the punishment for acting out? Check it out. Nation, this is what we all about. It's not about going in, yo, it's about getting out. In soon time, our thoughts will be a hate crime. And the only way nationless. Warrior songs. So here is to the uprisers. Did you see that? Pray for better days.
That was What's It All About by Just Jamel, the poet, featuring Lena Recollet. Check out the podcast description for links to more information on the musicians being played in this episode. I heard you say you have students, and so a little more about you.
Yeah.
Who are you, and how did you become involved?
For sure. So I grew up in Jane and Finch. My parents still live there. It's a lot of the community work I do is still there. I teach and work with a community organization called Success Beyond Limits, SBL. It's located in one of the high schools in Jane and Finch. It's called Westview Secondary School. And we support students who are making the transition from middle school to high school, and then support them throughout high school, and then help with the kind of choices they make after high school or post-secondary, whether it's college, university, trades, get them into like hopefully meaningful, important work that they find purpose in and that they can support themselves. So I've been working with that group, that organization since 2009. I also teach with Toronto Metropolitan University, used to be called Ryerson. I like X University better, but so I teach at TMU also and teach in the Sociology Department. And like some of my research really looks at communities like Jane and Finch and the ways that we build community power, activism, the kinds of set of conditions that mark our lives. So I'm really interested in that work. I also work on Black diasporas, or populations of Black folks that came from countries like Eritrea, from the Horn of Africa to the West or the global North. So places like the US, the UK, and Canada. So that's the kind of work that I do. I'm also like a certified secondary school and elementary school teacher. So I've taught in schools and stuff too.
All right. And now the reason I got in touch was defunding the police, the idea of that, especially at where I live. That's a foreign idea to people. They get confused. They think that you're just attacking their way of life. So can you explain what you mean when
For sure.
by that?
For sure, yeah. So growing up in a place like Jane and Finch, so it's a place that has a lot of like diverse racialized folks, right? So we come from all over the parts of the world, South America, the continent of Africa, from the Caribbean, and generational Canadians who've been here for a while, indigenous folks. And we're an area that's very much known in the country, in the city. I've had folks from Germany contact me saying, I'm doing research on Jane and Finch. I'm like, wow, okay. So, but it's an area that's known, at least perceived, to be violent, to be poor, to be dangerous, right? So when you have those kinds of things, those kinds of recipes that make up the perception of an area, what happens is you get a lot of police too. You get lots of police. You get hyper police. You get over police. I've always known police in my life, right? Growing up in Jane and Finch. So that means police is always around. And when police are always around and they're told that they're working in an area that's dangerous, it doesn't make for the best kinds of relations between the residents of the community and the neighborhood and the police officers that police them or are supposed to serve and protect and keep us safe, right? So I've only known policing to be really like a violent force, like dangerous. I'm scared when I see police. I'm scared when the young people I work with encounter police, right? So that is how we understand policing. Policing has never been a choice in an area like Jane and Finch or other areas like them, right? In Toronto, you'd have Melbourne, Regent Park, Scarborough, Rexdale, areas where there's very hyper policing. Policing is always known. So I've never known the idea that I would not have police around every time, all the time. And then I would just call the police and they would show up and kind of do what I say, help me in the way that I think that they would help me, right? One of the first memories I have of police is living in public housing with my parents. And I'm the oldest, so I was staying home babysitting. I was like 12 years old, not really supposed to leave your kids to babysit at that time. But my parents were working, multiple jobs, working hard. So that was the case, right? And I think when I remember them banging on the door, knowing that probably our parents were not supposed to leave us alone, but probably they also didn't have a choice because they had to work, part-time shift work, very low-paying jobs, but they were making it work. I remember the two police officers dressed in suits banging on my door. And I remember being terrified and trying to pretend like everything was okay, answering their questions. It was now what I would understand to be like an illegal kind of set of questions, but they were looking for my next door neighbor who was being accused of doing this or that. And I remember being very scared. My sisters were very scared too. And then that kind of interruption in my life, the unwanted presence, the feeling of terror is what police were all the time in that area and growing up in Jane and Finch in the community. So they would stop us on the street. They would come to our schools. They would know us by our names. They would come to our communities. They'd want to track all of us, right? And that has been how I know police. And then I've known folks in my community who have been beat up, who have been killed by police. My friends' homes who were raided. Police raid communities and houses and terrorize grandmas and grandfathers and parents and children. So that is how we understand police from the places where we live, right? That's foreign. That idea of a hyper police presence, police as dominating, as violent, as instilling terror, it's not commonly known in the city of Toronto or in other small towns perhaps, right? They just understand police to be a service. But we understand police to be by their old name, which is a force. So ever since I started working in community work in organizations, when I put on events, I would let people know that police are not going to be there. Police are not invited, right? So that people would come because people are scared of police and want to know if they've had contact with the criminal justice system, that they might not come to this community event if they know that there are going to be cops there. So for all of my work and the work that we do with that community organization, SBL, we don't work with police. We don't partner with them and we don't take money from them. We don't invite them to our events and we don't want to further instantiate police presence in our communities because our work as community workers and teachers and community organizers has always been to try to push police out of our lives so that we could live. When we have community events that are just simply about getting people together and having a good time, police show up from 31 Division. They just show up. I don't know how they find out, how they know they're never invited, but they always seem to have time and officers to send, and we don't invite them, right? So the idea of defunding the police comes from these sets of conditions where so many folks, and the last couple of years we've seen Black life cut short because of police. The idea is, can we reimagine or re-envision a society that looks different than the one that we have? Where when we give more money to police or let police more freely reign terror or just be all over the place, whether it's on the bus these days in Toronto, the debate, or in our schools or in our streets, we know that there's a whole swath of population that feels like how I feel, like how our community feels, that this doesn't make us feel safe, right? On site, this instills fear and terror in whole portions of our communities. But, if we're being honest, the folks that come from places like Jane and Finch or other poor working class communities, they're not the top of the political agenda, right? We don't really care what they think or they feel. We really care about what mostly white, mostly male, mostly able-bodied, mostly folks who own property, that is who this city government works for, right? So when they say that there's more violent instances on the bus or on public transportation or more crime in this area or that area, when they say let's put police there, they're really thinking about the folks for whom that doesn't instill fear, right? And that's people who are like the city's mayor, John Tory, white, male, rich, own property. When the police see him, They listen to him and the John Tory tells them what to do, or anybody that fits that profile. But for the rest of us, they try to stop us, force us on the ground, try to search us, tell us what to do, tell us to behave, don't act out of pocket, don't act out of line. You're not listening to me, you're resisting. And, that could be deadly for us, right? I'll just end with this. The Human Rights Commission's office in Ontario, we worked with them on a report that's ongoing around interactions, black folks who live in Toronto and their interactions with police. And they have a glaring statistic that I like to keep in the public consciousness, is that when a Black person is facing mental health crisis, so maybe, detached from reality or having whatever, seizure, any kind of, and seizure's not a mental health condition, but they're obviously unwell or experiencing crisis. When they interact with the police, they're 20 times more likely to die. To die, not to be hurt or to be injured or to be detained or arrested, but to die, right? So I think that is something. And that I connect that to the instance in Central Park, where there was the white woman who had a dog off her leash, and the Black man who said, by the way, that's against the bylaw. You want to put your dog back on the leash? It's against the city bylaws or city ordinance. And she said, no, you're harassing me. Don't talk to me. I'm going to call the police. They're going to handle you. So in that instance, what she's doing and what she deeply understands is what I'm saying. The police is her army. It's her force. They'll come and listen to her. While she is the one accosting the Black man, whose life is in danger if the police are introduced into that situation? It's his. That is what we're saying. Even if we take that intuitive understanding that white people know that when they call the police, they're going to come and listen to them, right? And what we're saying, or what defunding the police is doing, is saying, can we re-envision a society that doesn't include a force that makes whole swaths of people feel unsafe, right? Is there a different way we can use city resources where it doesn't have to be this force in our lives that make Black people, racialized folks, sex workers, trans people, Indigenous folks, all of those folks are not made more safe or feel more safe by police, right? So that defunding police is simply not a budget consultation. It's really an invitation to reimagine an entirely different society that doesn't need perhaps polices or prison, right? Or cages. And I think that is a kind of society I want my work, my community work, my research, my writing to point toward. I want to live towards that society, because that society makes us all feel better, all feel safe. And it's not simply like a kind of Black versus white thing, but it's an invitation to reimagine a radically different kind of world where policing is not the number one line item on our city budgets every year for the last 35 years. That is not like an invitation to imagine something new. It's just more of the same.
What you were saying there, even for me, I'm white, I come from a small town. Things are relatively good there, but anything except since I've been doing journalism, and at times they've had to maybe, I wouldn't say fear me, but be worried about what I'm going to write about them. There's always an intimidation side from them, even at the best of times. It's just kind of the way that they're trained. They'll take the upper, more aggressive side of the relationship. Even at the best of times.
You mean police, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
police.
It's the same thing when we have community meetings. Like when we had police in schools in Toronto here, in the Toronto District School Board, we had a set of community meetings, right? That were designed to say, like, you guys know that when we put police in these schools, not only is it opening the door to a kind of surveillance of our children, and let's be honest, they put police in areas like Jane and Finch, like my community, Black, racialized, poor. They didn't put them in like Forest Hill, which is like the bougie upper cost places. They didn't put them in Leaside, like these kinds of schools where, they put them in areas like Jane and Finch where the relationships between police and the community was already fraught, right? But these are the areas that need to be policed, as we understand, right? So when we had those meetings, the police would come and they would tell communities and school leaders, you guys know that response times are going to drop. But this is an introduction or a burden that was placed onto police that was not part of your normal operation. But what they are trained to do is to fight for their own self-purpose, their importance, right? This defunding police, which is really an invitation to question the need for policing as introducing safety, I think is scary for police whose entire modus operandi is about doubling down, tripling down on their own importance, right? And their own, role in society, which is what they've always done, right? But we should be clear that, the RCMP or the Met in the UK or in New York, the reason police has been, at its first instance, introduced into society has always been to survey and monitor the movements of indigenous folks, of black enslaved folks. And if we think about it really in 2023, they're really doing the same thing. They're monitoring us in my community. They're monitoring indigenous folks. They're monitoring folks who live on the street, who are unhoused, sex workers, trans folks. They are not monitoring, the folks that go to Queen's Park to work, or go to City Hall, or go to Parliament Hill, right? They are there to protect and serve really predominantly white middle class, upper middle class folks, and folks who own property. And that's been the case since the beginning of policing in this country and in the world, really, right? So I mean, I think defunding the police, and it's kind of as it coming into public consciousness, has been a great opening to a conversation, I think. And I think if more folks really understood the impetus for that charge or for that call, it's really a collective one for a better world, to be honest, right? So I think that's important to mention.
The divest and invest. So you're talking about taking money away from policing and putting it into social programs and things like that, so that what police are doing now may not be necessary, because it's kind of a Band-Aid solution but not fixing the cause.
Yeah, for sure, right? So I think the idea, a lot of folks call police, I think, out of a dearth of choices. There's nobody else to call, right? And I think if we change that fundamentally, we could get different kinds of responses, right? So I'll tell you a quick story. In Toronto, the report by Toronto Foundation coming out of the pandemic about how nonprofits and community organizations were doing in Toronto, they had a narrative in there. They interviewed a bunch of executive directors, nonprofit organization leaders, some institutional leaders, like folks who work at CAMH, which is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, or the health centers, like community health clinics. And there was all folks who just signed their name to their comments. There was one anonymous contribution. And this was a black person who is a nonprofit leader, like an executive director or something, right? And he told a story that he has a black family member who is experiencing mental health struggles, right? And he knows, even though there was instances where if he called the police, that it was he knows this stat. It's a gamble. I don't know if my family member is going to get care or going to get killed. This is really... So he tried to navigate the system, the mental health services, and said, well, how can I get services for my family member? They're experiencing this, let's go. He's trying to call folks, and this is a relatively well-educated person, middle-class job, navigates the nonprofit, the care system frameworks often for his work. And when he finally got the support for the family member, the right place, the person who was working in that support system or support organization or care place said to him, what's crazy? And he told them how hard it was to find you and to connect my family member without calling the police. The person working there said, what's dire or what's crazy is that if you called the police, your family member would have been a higher priority, right? So if they had called the police and the police brought that family member in as a, under a psychiatric hold or, whatever, some person experiencing mental health crisis, that they would, in their system, been higher priority than you bringing them in here as a family member, right? And that, knowing the fact that I just mentioned that stat before, that when black folks get called on and get the police called on them and they're experiencing mental health crisis, that's a gamble. It's a gamble. You could die, right? This has happened in the city of Toronto and beyond. And that is what black folks who need supports are managing, right? Whether you're experiencing mental health care or underhoused, you're receiving you work on the street and police get called, you don't know which way this will go. And that is, I think, what's at the heart of why do we put so many resources into policing and then ask police to do what police can't do, right? They don't know how to deal with folks in mental health crisis other than with a gun. They don't know how to deal with young people who are in communities, right? They only know how to detain, enforce violence, and then we have debates after the fact. Was the use of force justified? Rather than thinking about the ways in which we might create a society or a system that doesn't rely on policing to do this work, right? Even when we did some of those consultations and interviews with those police officers who were working in the schools, many of them did not want to be in the school. They were not trained for this, right? So this idea that police stops violence or that police, makes us all safer, it is a flight of fantasy. It's a fantastic notion. But what we do know is the ones who pay for it are people that look like me, who are Black, who are racialized, who are poor. It's not folks that look like the mayor of the city of Toronto, like John Tory. So they know that this is a safe bet for them, but it's a lethal one for so many of the folks in this city, right? And to be fair, we do have large numbers of those of us who are poor, working class, racialized, indigenous, but this city government and provincial government, we could be fair to say, really directs policy decisions to those, like I said, middle class, white, property owning folks. So when they instill more and more resources into policing and more faith into policing, they know they're not going to be the ones hurt by those decisions, but it'll be everybody else.
You're focusing on Toronto because that's where you're from, but it's got to be an across-the-board thing, like provincial and federal and beyond that, really, if possible, because you can't just have like the changes in Toronto and a model in Toronto and then have everything surrounding it working the same way. So are you working with other groups kind of more provincially, nationally?
Yeah. I mean, there is like a network of folks who, activists, advocates, community workers, grassroots collectives, who are talking to each other or having these kinds of conversations. And what we do understand and realize too is that the kinds of systems and frameworks and networks and relationships and safe and caring practices that are already bypassing police already exist. But by virtue of their necessity and their nature, they're not really well known, right? So in our community, my community organization at Success Beyond Limits, or SBL, we work with a lot of young people. Young people don't always make the best choices, and they always sometimes need care, understanding, redirection, conflict mediation. But we don't call police as a founding principle in our organization. So that has forced us to find other ways of, dealing with conflict, or, if harm has been inflicted, different ways of mediating, that we don't activate the criminal justice system. Because as you would imagine, for a young person who's Black, who's racialized, catching a charge is a life sentence for the rest of their life. To get this charge off, to get a good job, to get into a good school or college or program, trades program. We're attempting a different way of working with young people in our community organization that doesn't involve calling police. And that is happening across the city and across the province and across the country, where Indigenous folks, sex worker collectives and networks, folks who work on the street, all these kinds of different folks who would, on the surface, you would understand them as being in constant contact with policing, are attempting to build ways of keeping each other safe, dealing with conflict and harm and mediation, because defunding the police or abolishing police doesn't mean that there's no harm. It just means we have other ways of handling it or dealing with it that doesn't involve cages, that doesn't involve violence, using the police to activate violence on somebody else, right? So those practices are already happening. And we, in activists and grassroots networks, share those as practices, right? But they're under the radar because there's a level of risk, right? With bypassing police, with bypassing the criminal justice system or charges or, the Crown, right? So I think for us, this reality or this imagining of a different kind of way of doing things that doesn't involve policing is already here. It's already kind of tangible for us. As our young people know, who work with us at Success Beyond Limits, who come from middle school throughout to high school, they begin to understand that there are different ways of resolving conflict in a community where there's lots of conflict, neighborhood stuff, drama, territory and stuff. But when they come through our organization and work with us, they can call us and we can try out, be experimental with different ways of dealing with these situations. So I think it has to be, you're right, a kind of citywide, province-wide, federal, and global vision of a different kind of world. And I think we deserve that, as we're on the brink or coming, through a pandemic where lots of things were on the table that weren't before, right? Because we understand, like, this stuff is just not working for all of us. and we're dying, like literally dying. So, but we also know that those kinds of practices, alternatives to this version of society, it's not something we can go and just be front page about, right? So there's a level of risk in sharing that, but there are already sets of practices and relationships and relations that are already imagining a world without police, and it's already here. But I think how that rolls out and how that continues to get pushed, we'll see. Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit more about the level of risk what you mean by the level of risk?
I think in this current organization of society, right? If somebody does you harm, you are, supposed to call the police, report it, press charges, or, activate the Crown, get a lawyer, whatever, civil, all these kinds of things that come into play. But if you have come up with the understanding, like you would have maybe through JFAP, our organization, or SBL, or come up in a community where you don't feel or trust or really have any rational reason to think that the police will support you, you would have built up, or you would probably be in a community like Jane and Finch, where I grew up, and know that there would be somebody else you might call, a third party, maybe do some sort of kind of mediation if parties are involved or interested. Think about what restitution or justice might look like for you that gets organized and mediated through trusted community conveners.
So sort of restorative justice without the police being involved.
Exactly, right? Which is, these are difficult. These are hard, right? There's very little resources. It's a lot of trust you have to place into community folks. But if I do know that, and many instances where this does work is folks that live really close to each other and maybe known each other for a long time, or even some folks who are in domestic relationships, all these kinds of things. But I do know that if this person harmed me or did wrong by me, I do not want to call the police. One, they could die, especially if they're Black or racialized, if they live in my community. And two, I want to find a solution that makes me whole, that we can understand and agree on, and then, a set of practices moving forward for whatever this looks like, so this doesn't happen again. And we both trust some third-party community convener, right? And like I said, these things are messy. They're not clean-cut. There's, sometimes even lawyers do get involved. It's case by case. There's no resources for it. This is not, the public system. But we do have at the core an understanding that if police get involved, then there's probably going to be cages and prison or jail involved, and those are things that folks don't want. So what is something else, an alternative? And there are people in the city here, activists, grassroots folks, who can support processes like that. And why I say that there's a level of risk is that, like we mentioned before, police don't like being irrelevant, right? They want to, their raison d'etre is to constantly be in the center of it. They don't want to be illegitimate. And I think some of these practices that operate below the radar make them irrelevant, make them illegitimate. The fact that we may be able to solve issues amongst ourselves that are nonviolent, don't involve handcuffs or guns, don't involve cages. And, at some point it may be, it's, in this kind of quasi-legal space, right? So you don't want to publicly broadcast a lot of these. So there's risk with that. And I think those things, in order to operate as they are, also need to be protected and kept inside. Which also, I would just like to say that many well-connected, well-networked white folks do that already. This happens, we understand usually after the fact that they do this too, right?
Yeah.
Actual police officers who are avoiding the wrath of the criminal justice system by activating their own networks.
I was just doing some stuff kind of for myself, where I was looking at the budget in my own small town area, and policing was the biggest chunk of the pie.
It is, right? Yeah.
Even there.
It never fails, I think, yeah.
Yeah, but then compared to it, programs and facilities, which is where all the social programs would fall under, was about equal, but that means policing gets that whole chunk of whatever, it's 2.5 million in our small town, and all those programs then share about
2.5 million. Wow,
yeah,
that's intriguing. Yeah,
so Yeah, I was just noticing that.
Yeah, I just want to say too, I think, like pushing, defunding the police is not only a budget consultation. Yeah. For sure, we are looking at the budgets and we're saying it is a staggering amount of money, especially in the city of Toronto, or you go to LA, Chicago, all the places where all of our comrades are having the same conversations. It's a staggering amount of money. And when we have these kinds of conversations where defunding the police is trying to get folks into thinking about the philosophy of policing, like what is at the core at its ideology, right? And then a lot of the defensive folks who say we need policing are also folks who don't see police every day, like live in our communities where, oh my God, like our young people, sometimes when they're walking to school, they know that if they walk with like girls or they walk in like a 2 or 3 group instead of a larger group and they map out their route, they know they won't be followed by police. Like that's crazy for grade 5, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds to be thinking about. But also too for the folks who argue for policing, who never saw police officers months at a time, never need to call the police, is also at the heart of it, they're saying something about us, like as people, right? That if we don't have policing, that we would just descend into chaos. I don't believe that, right? When we're able to push policing out of our communities and our presence, especially in communities like Jane and Finch, where people think we are just violent all the time, there is no violence. Violence usually emerges when the police come and they detain and they push and they bully and they, point guns and all that. So saying that we don't need this constant municipal army to hog up all the resources in any city, small or big, is also to say that we can take care of ourselves with each other and we can be peaceful, right? But this idea, particularly, let's be honest, for mostly middle-class folks who own property, who, have a lot of money, a lot of this defensive policing is rooted in the fact that they really believe that if there's no policing, there would just be looting and chaos and their homes or their white picket fences won't protect them if we don't have policing. So I want us to question what that says about us, about each other, what we're saying, that the only thing perhaps knitting us together in this social fabric is policing. And simply for many of us who think that policing needs to be defunded and abolished, that's not the case. That the thing that's keeping us together or safe is not policing, right? But a shared humanity. Understanding that if you're not well and you're not taken care of and you're not housed, then I'm not. This kind of really this ideology that perhaps if we have found better ways of taking care of each other collectively, that we would live better. Yeah. So just wanted to mention that.
That kind of goes into the other part of what I was finding out when I was studying for this locally for me, because the reason it seems that people want to spend that money or keep the police involved is because we're getting fed a lot of media that induces fear. Like right now, even we're 2 hours away, we're hearing all kinds of things about the attacks on the TTC. Mm-hmm. And we're hearing all about the problems with catch and release at the federal level.
Bail conditions, yeah.
Yeah, so we're hearing all that and it keeps us scared in the whole thing and worried that we're not protected.
Yeah. I think part of what's at the heart of that too, and especially with these instances on the bus, we would, if we were to dig deeper, we would probably more clearly understand that what's at the heart or root of those are probably conditions of basic life necessities. So are folks housed? Are they getting the help that they need, the care that they need, the mental health supports? Those unchecked factors, or that part of the safety net blanket that has holes in it, it spills over into these kinds of things in public, right? Not to mention that the public transportation itself is underfunded, is poor. That probably elicits as much frustration too from the general public. So I think we would be better served to look at those kind of roots, those deep roots that's causing these kinds of things and conditions to emerge, rather than thinking that if we pumped more into policing that they would prevent that, right? So we're not going to have, they may try, but we don't have enough police officers for every bus, for every subway car or every platform, right? But that's the track that they've taken, right? The city, the policing force. So we need to question that, right? We need to question that. And I think in this idea of society that we imagine to be different than the one that we're living in, we probably have to put at the crosshairs of our analysis is the media, right? So much of the media is definitely, it's not to inform, but either to entertain or to terrorize, right? And when we're scared, what I found for, and I'm a sociologist by trade, my PhD's in sociology, when we're scared and when we're feared and when we have these kinds of moments of spectacular violence, that's not when we do our best thinking or our best imagining, right? That's when we lean back on our kind of most conservative, traditional hearted notions. And that means putting more into police. Even though we understand that in any of these instances on the bus or any instance of interpersonal violence, police can't get there fast enough to prevent it from happening. They always get there after the fact. So it's by its very definition, by its nature as a service, in air quotes, it's never preventative. The preventative mode is to put more into the caring practices, the caring organizations that care for folks before any of these instances can occur, right? So I think if our better bet, if we wanted to think of it that way, like a public policy analyst or better investment, is to put it into the kinds of places that will care for all of us so that these moments don't happen. So whether it's mental health professionals, caring places, the kinds of, increasing the number of shelters and warming centers that are available so that folks are not left to their own devices on the streets. I think that's a more humane, more long-term, more fundamentally caring approach than putting it into policing and then seeing what happens.
Because I was making a note about how you said many of the people who are for policing never really have to deal with them. They never get policed. So they've got a totally
detached perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but also we should understand too that in so many folks' mind, especially for those who don't interact with police on the daily, they've just equated police and safety, right? Mm-hmm. Police and they're the only thing keeping us from descending into chaos and civil unrest, right? Like if the police were not funded as the number one line item in all of our city's budgets, then something would happen. They would be in more danger, right? I mean, I think that's a fundamental misreading of society, but one that the media and traditional normative politicians voice. They say these things, right? And then police come to our community meetings where we're discussing these ideas and say, well, if we defund the police, response times will be lower, right? In Jane and Finch, or where I've grown up, police response time has always been bad. They've never shown up enough in time to care for us or to mitigate some sort of danger. But they're always at our community groups and rallies, our meetings, or whether if there's a strike going on, or we have this thing called Corner Commons where we do performances. Police always seem to find their way there, So I think we should understand where those defenses of police come from, and that, I think we should also understand that people might get scared at the idea of defunding the police or a society without policing because they have that kind of, they've equated police and safety, right? Even though if they really examine their own histories, they very rarely interact with police and rarely interact with folks like myself or other folks who live in communities where they are hyper-policed, right? So this, all this coverage about defunding the police, questioning the philosophy of policing, I think is important so that folks understand that they're living in a city, perhaps that's very different from somebody else who lives in that same city, who lives in these communities that are hyper-policed. And I think if we begin to have these very serious, long-term conversations, that we might get to a better, different place.
You've already kind of hit on this at the beginning, but I want to maybe emphasize it. At the grassroots, what is being done, what can be done, what do you encourage people to do to maybe just get the ideas that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think right now there's a lot of more literature, podcasts, interviews on mainstream media that are tackling these questions. And, I think for a lot of folks who are coming into the idea of thinking about the role that policing plays, I think that's wonderful. I think that's great. And also to learn from those folks who have been having these conversations for a long time, as I do with my students and folks with whom I work in community. There's this kind of, and it's drilled in very young, right? We get the Elmo, the police people come into our middle schools and talk to kids and, put on really great face of a service that supports us. and all this. And so it's inculcated very young that the police are your friend. Any emergency, call 911, do this, do that, right? And if I try to get students or folks who are new to this conversation to say, okay, what if you stopped and said, if I introduce policing into this situation, and there are Black folks, racialized folks, Indigenous folks, or folks who are trans, sex workers, I'm introducing an element of danger. If I introduce police into this, and you just take a minute, a pause, before you just immediately call 911. What else opens up? What are the different kinds of ways you might mediate this conflict if it's not, immediate danger? What are some other ways that you might handle this situation, I think, is to begin to do these kinds of thought experiments, right? And then to connect with some of the literature and some of the folks who are already doing this, to imagine, can you really begin to articulate or imagine a society that is very different than the one that we have, that doesn't have policing? And do you want to live in that place? Do you want to live in that kind of world, right? Because as what we do already understand, based on innumerable amounts of evidence, is that police kill, harm, don't support Black folks, racialized folks, Indigenous folks, folks who are poor, who are working class in this city and its surrounding cities and in this province. You know that to be true. So then we have to, I think for me, think about how do we keep all of our people safe, right? And that the answer to that is not policing. So then what else can we explore? And I think having those kinds of conversations in concert with other people and somebody who studies social movements, that's always been the beginning of great things, right? So whether it's like free healthcare, the labor movement in this province, the introduction of the weekend, the 8-hour workday, all of these things really started with a set of people, whether they were in power politically or not, who have got together and imagined their society as different than the one that they're currently in. And I think that defunding the police is an invitation to do that, to imagine a different kind of world. And maybe, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we might look back at this time and not be able to recognize a time where we had all our city budgets, if it's still going to be capitalism, that policing was the number one thing, right? Now we can't imagine life without a weekend. We have child labor laws. It wasn't too long ago that this place employed children at really, very difficult work conditions. We have laws around how many work hours folks can work, what happens if you get hurt on the job, equal opportunity employment. All of these things are things that we now can't imagine living without. But I think we can think about a society that doesn't have policing, that keeps everybody safe. I think that's possible. So those are some things I think folks could do, whether you're in a big city or a small town.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks for talking to me. And is there anything else you can think of that you'd like to get in there?
Just that with JFAP, we're going to continue to have political conversations. We call it Political Cafe, where we talk about things like, things that are connected to policing, like white supremacy, colonialism, extraction, like, oil extraction or mineral extraction, all these kinds of things that structure Canadian life. So we're going to continue to have Political Cafe conversations. They're going to be online and Zoom, and everybody's invited. So check out JFAP's Twitter or Instagram, because those will be starting back up probably in the spring. And we continue to have conversations like these where we think about what, offshore mining does to Canadian life or to Indigenous lands, oil pipelines. We talk about the white supremacy that society's founded on. We talk about Indigenous land back movements, policing. So if folks are interested in those kinds of conversations, just tap into what we do at JFAP. And they are kind of like popular education styles kind of engagements where folks can learn about these kinds of things and these kinds of conversations.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Yeah. This was great, man. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Wake up, wake up, wake up. Wake up, wake up, wake up. Bigger than your wicked system. bigger than your monarchy, bigger than your quiet mission, bigger than your fake democracy, louder than your education, built to push your lies, bigger than your segregation. You won't control our lives, and I say, yeah, wake up, wake up, wake up, sleeping giant. Wake up, wake up, wake up, sleeping giant. Louder than your empty promise, louder than your arms, louder than your foolish comments, louder than your bombs, bigger than your false division, keeping us apart, louder than your false religion that warps the truth inside our hearts. And I say, yeah, wake up, wake up, wake up, sleeping giant. Wake up, wake up, wake up, sleeping giant. Waking up the sleeping giant, opening our eyes. Is it wrong if we're defiant of arbitrary lines, screaming out for revolution? Is it not the time, calling out for evolution, beginning in our minds? And I say, yeah, wake up, wake up, wake up, sleeping giant. Wake up, wake up, wake up, sleeping giant.
Afrika ni jitu ambalo limelala. Lazima tuamke, tujiimarishe kwa unyenyekevu na ujasiri mkuu. Lengo liwe ni kujiinua kimaisha, kiuchumi na pia kimaendeleo, ili tuvilinde vizazi vijavyo.
Rounding out this episode, that was Sleeping Giant by Ian Kamau. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Sam for the interview. Check out the description wherever you are listening to this for links to more information, or visit woodstein.ca. That's WOOD-STEIN.ca. You can support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Colin Burrows. Listen, like, share, follow, and support Woodstein Media and this podcast, and have a great day.